In the 1980s, my late friend Ariel set off on a camping trip to the Mapami Silent Zone. This desert area was famous for its frequent UFO sightings and strange occurrences. Ariel loved the solitude and mystery of the desert, finding both adventure and peace under its vast, star-studded sky. One evening, after setting up his camp and enjoying the stillness of the desert, he laid down on the sand, gazing up at the stars. The night was calm, the air cool and refreshing. The quiet of the desert was a soothing balm for his soul, and he soon drifted into a peaceful sleep under the clear, open sky. Suddenly, in the middle of the night, Ariel was jolted awake by an unsettling feeling. The once tranquil night sky now seemed different. As he sat up and looked around, he noticed strange lights on the horizon. These lights flickered and shifted, unlike anything he had seen before. Their colors were unnatural, changing rapidly and casting an eerie glow over the distant dunes. Instinctively, Ariel reached for his binoculars. He needed to get a closer look at these lights to understand what was happening. As he peered through the lenses, the lights grew brighter and more erratic. His heart began to race. The lights seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, making him feel incredibly uneasy. Then, without warning, a voice echoed in his mind. It was clear and chilling, unlike anything he had ever experienced. "You don't belong here. Get out!" The voice was not his own but seemed to come from the desert itself. Ariel's sense of danger intensified. The voice carried a weight, a sense of urgency that he couldn't ignore. Fear gripped him. He felt a primal urge to leave immediately. He hurriedly packed his things, his hands shaking as he shoved items into his backpack. The calm he had felt earlier was replaced by a deep sense of dread. Every rustle of the wind and every shadow in the darkness seemed menacing, as though the desert itself was warning him to leave. As he packed, Ariel couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The strange lights on the horizon continued to flicker, casting long, eerie shadows across the sand. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, his breath quick and shallow. The sense of being unwelcome, of being an intruder in this vast, empty place, was overwhelming. Finally, with his backpack hastily packed, Ariel ran to his car. He barely noticed the sharp rocks and sand underfoot as he scrambled to get inside. Once in the car, he fumbled with the keys, his hands still trembling. The drive back was a blur of anxious energy. The desert landscape, once so inviting, now seemed hostile and alien. He didn't stop driving until he reached the nearest town, where he finally felt safe enough to catch his breath. Looking back at the vast expanse he had fled from, Ariel couldn't believe what had happened. The experience left him shaken and confused. He had always loved the desert, but this encounter had changed everything. Ariel never returned to the Mapami Silent Zone. He continued to share tales of his travels with friends, filling them with fascinating and fun stories. However, the encounter in the desert left a deep mark on him. Despite his love for desert camping, the fear he felt that night never truly faded. The memory of those strange lights and the chilling voice haunted him for the rest of his life. He spoke of the incident less and less as time went on, but the shadow of that night lingered in his eyes. The desert, once a source of wonder and peace, had become a place of deep, unsettling dread. It was a reminder that some places are better left unexplored, their mysteries unsolved. The Mapami Silent Zone remained a haunting memory, a place where Ariel had felt the presence of something beyond understanding, urging him to leave and never return. As a kid, I lived in a camper in the woods on my grandma's huge property. It wasn't just big in the eyes of a child, it was genuinely massive. My grandma had a farm with cows, and one night a storm rolled in and knocked out the power. This, in turn, shut down the electric fence, and one of the cows got out. The next day, my teenage cousins decided to go find the missing cow, and I, a 6-year-old, insisted on tagging along. I put on my snow boots, even though it wasn't snowing, and we set out. We wandered through the vast property for hours, following what we thought were tracks, but they always seemed to lead to nowhere. Eventually, we reached a part of the property that was off limits. This area had a treacherous creek, notorious for its dangerous currents. One wrong step, and you'd be swept away. We were about to turn back when we spotted a cow grazing in the distance. My immediate thought was, "This isn't the cow we're looking for. How did it get here?" As we got closer, it became clear that this cow was different. It was wild, almost feral. Instead of grazing on grass, it was feasting on the remains of the missing cow. The sight was horrifying. We panicked, convinced that this cannibal cow was going to come after us next. We ran as fast as we could back to the house, our minds racing with fear and confusion. Back at the house, we told Grandma and our uncle what we had seen. Surprisingly, they didn't call us crazy. Instead, they asked if the cow we saw was almost completely black. It was hard to tell through the dirt and grime, but we thought so. Grandma then explained that a few years ago, another cow had gone missing during a storm and was never found. They had assumed it had fallen victim to the woods, and they figured this cow had met the same fate. They decided to investigate, and went out to find the carcass. They discovered that the missing cow had been struck by lightning, and had died before the feral cow began eating it. Although it hadn't eaten much, to us kids it had seemed like a lot. That was the first time I saw a dead cow and the only time I saw a cow eating another cow. It left a deep impression on me. The property had always felt a bit eerie, especially with the knowledge that 5 people had been murdered there. The strange events didn't end with the cannibal cow. There was also a blind pony on the farm, blinded by a lightning strike years before. The pony had survived the initial strike but had become mostly blind and eventually deaf. It lived for several more years until one day, it fell down a hill and died, likely due to its old age and failing senses. Living on my grandma's property was an experience filled with odd and unsettling moments. The sheer size of the land, coupled with its history and the strange events that seemed to happen there, left a lasting mark on my childhood. The memory of that feral cow, the lightning-struck pony, and the stories of the past still linger in my mind, reminders of a time when the world seemed much bigger and far more mysterious. Last summer, I decided to go camping in a remote part of the forest. I had been to this area once before, and it was known for its pristine beauty and complete isolation. After a busy few months at work, I was looking forward to some peace and quiet. I packed my gear and drove out early in the morning. The drive was long, but the scenery was stunning. I arrived at the trailhead by noon, parked my car, and began my hike. The forest was dense and lush, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and occasional bird calls. After a few hours of hiking, I found a clearing next to a small stream that seemed like the perfect spot to set up camp. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and set up a small fire. As the sun began to set, I cooked a simple meal and enjoyed the tranquility of the forest. The night was clear, and the stars were bright in the sky. I felt at peace, far from the stress of daily life. After cleaning up, I sat by the fire for a while, just listening to the sounds of the forest. Eventually, I decided it was time to turn in. I put out the fire, crawled into my tent, and settled into my sleeping bag. The night was cool, and the sounds of the forest soon lulled me to sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. I lay still, listening intently. The forest, which had been full of gentle noises, was now eerily silent. Not a single insect chirped, and there was no rustling of leaves. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. A sense of unease crept over me. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just the natural quiet of the night. But then I heard it, a faint, distant sound, almost like a low hum. It was barely perceptible, but it sent chills down my spine. The sound grew louder, seeming to come from all directions at once. It was an unnatural noise, something I couldn't place. I lay there, heart pounding, trying to figure out what it could be. The hum turned into a series of whispers, like dozens of voices speaking in hushed tones just outside my tent. I couldn't make out any words, but the tone was unsettling. My mind raced, thinking of all the stories I'd heard about the supernatural. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to stay put, but I had to know what was out there. Slowly, I unzipped my tent, careful not to make a sound. The whispers seemed to retreat slightly as I did so. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the cold night. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but revealed nothing out of the ordinary. The forest looked the same, yet felt completely different. I stood still, listening. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an almost oppressive silence. The air felt thick, and I could feel my pulse in my ears. I took a few cautious steps, scanning the trees with my flashlight. That's when I saw it, a shape, darker than the night, standing just beyond the reach of my light. It was tall and unmoving, almost like a shadow given form. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The shape didn't move, didn't make a sound. I couldn't see any details, just the outline of something that shouldn't be there. Panic surged through me. I backed away slowly, not daring to take my eyes off it. As I reached my tent, the shape seemed to dissolve into the darkness. I scrambled back into my tent and zipped it up as fast as I could. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, sitting up with my flashlight clutched in my hand, listening for any sound. The whispers never returned, but the sense of being watched remained. At first light, I packed up my gear in record time. I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed as I hiked back to my car. The forest, which had seemed so inviting, now felt sinister and threatening. When I finally reached my car, I threw my backpack in the back seat and drove off without looking back. I've camped in many places, but I've never returned to that forest. Whatever was out there that night remains a mystery, but the fear it instilled in me is something I won't forget. The peace I had sought was replaced with a deep-seated dread, a reminder that some places are better left undisturbed. I'll start by saying I absolutely hate the woods. Camping isn't my idea of a good time. I'm a pretty big guy, 6 feet 2 inches and around 195 to 200 pounds. But for some reason, the woods and backcountry just don't sit right with me. Since I was a kid, I've always been a bit paranoid and trust my instincts a lot. In 2019, before my 20th birthday, I found myself in a situation I wasn't thrilled about. My best friend, who I'll call Dee, his fiancée Mo, her best friend, and 3 other high school friends and I decided to go camping. Dee and Mo were born and raised in the county backwoods, while I grew up in a more rural urban area. I was used to gunshots and creepy night sounds, but the woods were a whole different beast. We arrived at this secluded spot about half a mile into the woods, a flat area around 200 feet in diameter. The moment we got there, I was on high alert. My senses were heightened, and I felt uneasy. The woods always make you see and hear things that aren't there, or so it seems. That day, Dee, one of our other friends, let's call him Jay, and I decided to explore deeper into the woods. We were chatting and reminiscing, trying to stay lighthearted despite the unsettling atmosphere. Dee and Jay seemed perfectly at ease, which only made me more nervous. I had a constant feeling of being watched, like something or someone was lurking just out of sight. When we finally made it back to the camp, everyone was sitting around the fire, snacking and laughing. Despite my attempt to stay relaxed, my paranoia was off the charts. I tried to mask my anxiety by joking around and making dark humor comments, but inside, I was on edge. I wear glasses at night because my vision isn't great, though I usually avoid them during the day due to light sensitivity. As I glanced to my left, I thought I saw a large figure, about 9 to 10 feet tall, standing about 100 to 120 feet away. It was massive, like a giant silhouette, think a much larger version of Shaquille O'Neal. I wasn't sure if I saw it correctly, but when I looked back at the fire for just a moment and turned back, the figure was gone. I didn't say anything to the group. My senses were screaming at me, but for some reason, I chose to stay quiet. My heart raced, and I kept my Glock and Arkansas close by, along with my Bowie knife, all night. Despite my paranoia, nothing happened, other than my imagination running wild. The next day, we packed up and left the woods. The whole time, I kept my mouth shut about what I saw. The experience left me deeply unsettled, and whenever they brought up camping again, I'd make up excuses to avoid it. The woods had gotten under my skin, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, or worse, stalking us. I still think about that night and the massive figure I saw. I haven't told anyone about it, and I doubt I ever will. The sight of that towering silhouette still haunts me, and the feeling of being watched is something I can't ignore. Whenever someone suggests camping, my stomach knots up, and I find every possible excuse not to go. The woods had given me a glimpse of something that night, something I couldn't explain, but it was enough to make me stay far away from those dark, unsettling places.